Today in that same community, there are curfews. Really, there's no one outside after 7 or 8 in the night. Recruitment of children has picked up significantly into the conflict. And the farmer knows that this isn't an invitation, this is a threat. Despite the fact that on paper, the military's priority is to protect civilians. In reality, the first, second, third, fourth, fifth priorities were not to protect civilians, but in fact, were to achieve operational results, to have a high number of captures, to eradicate large amounts of coca. That sort of impossible position of civilians right in the middle, literally in a conflict between the military on the one hand and an armed group in the other, with the illicit economy in the middle, we as Crisis Group had a unique ability to step into that space. So Colombia is one of the conflicts in Latin America that's the longest running in the region. Over 50 years of conflict between the government and insurgency movements, the largest of which was the FARC.
The Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, brutal insurgency against the Colombian government.
Conflict that's lasted more than 50 years and cost more than 200,000 lives. Colombia's president and the leader of the FARC rebel group signed a ceasefire agreement.
Violence has flared up again recently.
When you went to rural Colombia in 2017, the year after the peace agreement was signed, I remember a farmer telling me in a part of Cauca on the Pacific coast, this was the first time we could go out at night and not be afraid. We would go walking by the river and look at the stars, and it was the first time that we'd ever been able to do that. Because there wasn't any FARC, there wasn't any armed group threat that would prevent us from going out late, from being nervous, from worrying about how our children would get to school. And there was you felt like really like Colombia was taking a breath for the first time in many years. And what's happened since has really been extremely difficult to watch, because I think there was a missed opportunity in terms of the implementation of the 2016 agreement. The whole idea of the 2016 peace accord was that the state would come in and fill those gaps that the FARC had left behind, that they would establish schools and health centers and a legitimate security presence in those areas. And unfortunately, when that didn't happen, or it didn't happen quickly enough, because armed and criminal groups were much more nimble, much faster, much more interested in going to these difficult rural areas where there's very hard road access. When they started to fill that space, what we saw was that conflict returned. And so in that same area where the farmer was telling me about the freedom of going out at night, all the types of violence that we'd seen in the past started to return. Today in that same community, there are curfews. Really, there's no one outside after 7 or 8 in the night. Recruitment of children has picked up significantly into the conflict. And there's a sense really that this opportunity, if it wasn't lost, it wasn't taken advantage of to its fullest. And what we've particularly seen in recent years is that groups such as the FARC dissidents, is that they will come to an area and oblige farmers to plant coca. In other words, they come to the house, the farm, let's say, oh, these are beautiful pineapple crops you have here. Let's plant coca. We'll give you the first seeds. And the farmer knows that this isn't an invitation. This is a threat. Because you either plant coca, or you rent your land to someone who will plant coca, or you leave. And those are the choices that many farmers face. Farmers plant the coca. They follow the rules that are literally at gunpoint in many cases. And then one of the situations that's been reoccurrent in recent years is the military then, with its mandate to eliminate coca crops, would come and forcibly eradicate those crops, which puts the farmer in an impossible situation. On the one hand, he wants to protect his livelihood. This is the only way that he'll be able to feed his children, send his kids to school. On the other hand, the armed group is telling the farmer, you have to resist this eradication. Stand up essentially as a human shield against the military as they seek to eradicate your crops. The military, from the other hand, viewing these farmers as in the illegal market, which is true, but in many ways these farmers are more victims than they are perpetrators of any crime. that sort of impossible position of civilians right in the middle, literally in a conflict between the military on the one hand and an armed group on the other, with the illicit economy in the middle. This is exemplary of what relationships in rural areas have been with the military. So we first came to this topic actually by accident. I was doing research in Cauca along the Pacific coast, of course interviewing communities, but then I would also go and see the military as well, because they would have a different understanding of the conflict, and we wanted to hear also their perspective. And we started to hear two things. On the one hand, communities always wanted more and better security presence. They wanted more police, they wanted more military, but they didn't want the military as it existed. They wanted a different military. They wanted a different police force that would actually protect them, that they could see as a place to report crime, as a place to go to where they had difficulties. And on the other hand, the military, we started to hear, from generals in the field, frustrations, concerns. I remember I had a very important conversation with a general along the Pacific coast, where there's a conflict between several FARC dissident fronts, and he would tell me, sometimes I don't know if I'm doing more harm or good in my operations. I want to protect civilians, but I don't have time. I'm getting calls from, the political leaders asking me how much coca I can eradicate, asking me how many people I can arrest and capture. And that pressure takes away all the ability and the capacity, all the manpower, the forces, the helicopter hours that I have to think about how I might actually protect these people. That conversation for me was really pivotal, because it said to me, the military understands that what they're doing isn't having the desired effect, and in some cases may even be exacerbating the situation. The military also has a deep understanding of what's happening in the field and probably some good ideas about how to fix it. At the same time, the community knows what they want and what they don't want. So let's try to figure this out. So we started to do exactly that. On the one hand, talking to communities and saying, what's your relationship with the military? What would you like it to be? What's missing? What do you need? And at the same time, going to the military and asking, what's not working? What would you need in order to improve the situation? If you were told to protect civilians, what would that look like? And what we started to understand is that despite the fact that on paper, the military's priority is to protect civilians, in reality, the incentives and the political pressures were for something entirely different. The first, second, third, fourth, fifth priorities were not to protect civilians, but in fact, were to achieve operational results, to have a high number of captures, to eradicate large amounts of coca. And unfortunately, none of those things had a positive impact on the actual daily lives of the community. So this is where we started to think, let's bridge this gap. So one of the things that we did was really make an effort to talk to brigade commanders. That is to say, really the generals and colonels who are in the field dealing with the situation on a day-to-day basis. I think one of the pivotal moments for me was when, instead of going to commanders myself, some of those commanders started to come back to us. And they would sort of explain challenges that they were having or frustrations and say, what do you see? What do you hear? What do you see in the field? Because they really wanted to have this other perspective of what were communities thinking and hear that voice about what was the perception of how their actions were actually landing on the ground. That for me was really important because it showed that there was this openness to having these discussions and also, frankly, a deep interest, not from one, not from two, but numbers and numbers of brigade commanders who really wanted to do a better job of protecting civilians but felt that they didn't have the tools. So there was a broad debate at the moment, more generally within Colombia, about why the security strategy wasn't working. And we realized that we as Crisis Group were really uniquely placed to start to speak to this conversation because we had these deep military relationships and we had these deep access inside communities to really talk frankly about the situation. And we'd frankly developed the trust to protect both sides in that situation. So we realized we as Crisis Group had a unique ability to step into that space. So we invested really deeply in trying to construct our relationships with communities on the one hand, many of whom are living in very difficult situations where speaking about what's happening is not allowed. because of the presence of armed groups, there's a lot of fear about raising concerns about what's happening. So we invested really deeply in those relationships so that they could have frank conversations with us about what it meant to live in these places, what they felt that they were missing. And at the same time, within the military, this is an institution that I think is used to being criticized from the outside, and not by people who understand what it's like to be that soldier who's sent out to the field as the only manifestation of the state. And we really wanted to break that. We wanted to get, really be empathetic with both the soldier on the ground and give him tools to better address these situations, and with the communities who were so desperately in need of better security. So after we'd spoken to communities and commanders and a number of others for a number of months across Colombia, we visited, I think, over 12 departments, many of the most conflict-affected regions of the country. We started to put together a list of ideas of how we could better protect civilians in the context of this very complex and changing conflict. We started to float those ideas really around the time of the election. So sharing our ideas with different candidates, but also sort of floating them in the public space. I think what we saw after that is that many of the ideas did start to stick. They started to get picked up in the media when people wrote opinion pieces and conversations. We would share the ideas with different campaigns. We would try to understand how they were seeing the situation as well. I think what this did was it put Crisis Group in a position where we were sort of gently feeding the public debate. And it really did push the debate forward. We never expected what happened in June 2022, which was the election of the first, in recent history, left-wing president in Colombia, Gustavo Petro.
Es historia lo que estamos escribiendo en este momento, una historia nueva para Colombia, para América Latina, para el mundo.
So since the Petro administration took office, they've taken the very important decision to shift the military's focus directly towards protecting civilians. I think this is fundamental, and it's really the core of what we as Crisis Group had also recommended. The Petro administration is framing its approach as something called human security, which is a more integral way to think about security. It's not just about providing protection, but also about opportunities and jobs and development and education. That holistic approach really reshapes the military's role. In the initial months of the Petro administration, one of the really engaging things that started to happen was we started getting calls from the military. Will you come talk to us about what you did, about your work? Will you come share your findings with us? This was a really unique opportunity for us because we were able to share insights from their own colleagues in the field, as well as our observations on the ground from what we see in day-to-day life of communities. The military, I think, senses and understands, as we had heard from so many in the field, the need to evolve and to shift and to focus really on how do you keep communities safe. And so I think they saw Crisis Group as a source of ideas. And we were very glad to sort of enter that conversation with them. The Petro government's security strategy adopts a lot of the ideas that we started to help float in the public space. So one of the key changes that they've decided to make is a shift in the indicators. The priorities previously were captures, eradication, sort of hard operations against these groups. And what the Petro administration is considering is using a broader set of indicators that actually tell us about daily life on the ground. So is it safe to send your kid to school? Is there forced recruitment? Are there curfews implemented by illegal armed groups? What's the level of violence against local community leaders? These sorts of indicators can help give the security strategy a broader understanding of what impact it's having. So I think all of us in Colombia are really committed to continuing to working on this really important shift in security. This is something I feel a lot of personal attachment to because I really did come to understand, I think, what it's like on both sides of that picture. Conflict continues to be a reality for large parts of Colombia today, and I think one of the keys to unraveling this conflict is improving this trust between the military and communities. This is a long-term process, and it's one that I think is really important for us at Crisis Group to stay involved in, to be a part of that conversation, and I think we're committed to doing that. to raising the perspectives both of communities and the military and others and trying to think of those solutions. There isn't a finish line to rebuilding that trust. We're committed to staying through the entire journey.